In the past few years, an important part of the gameplay experience has been slowly sacrificed at the altar of immersion. Heads-up displays, or HUDs, were once a vibrant and iconic element. Now they're but a wispy ghost of their former selves, only appearing to announce a snowball or bullet-based opportunity. We've gotten to the point where immersion is synonymous with having no UI elements. But I'm sure a professional, experienced designer of UIs would agree with me that immersion is much more complicated.
How do I define immersion? Again, anywhere where the UI is not present in the game is probably the first and foremost answer.
Outrageous! If Zane isn't going to defend unnecessarily elaborate UI, then it's up to me. But even I have to admit that UIs have earned their bad rep. If you're a big AAA game trying to tell a dramatic, emotional story, the worst thing that can happen is, it's a button prompt that ruins the mood, and suddenly your serious game is a meme. Obviously, intrusive UI can be disruptive to immersion, but actually, Press F proves that immersion is more than just removing any element that reminds you you're playing a game. Immersion wasn't always a buzzword in games because, look at this. Being sensorily transported to another world wasn't really a risk until relatively recently. Early UIs often existed outside of the frame of the game world because there simply wasn't enough graphical fidelity to put it on top. As resolution and color palettes grew, it became less necessary to cordon off these elements, allowing the game world to expand and the HUD to sit on top like fat, friendly little beetles resting on a leaf. A lot of HUDs in the 90s and 2000s had a design flourish that I am obsessed with and that we just don't see in big games anymore. It's called skeuomorphism. A skeuomorph is an element in a digital interface that looks or sounds like the real-world analog it's based on. The fact that the function that removes data from your hard drive is shaped like a little trash can, that is a skeuomorph, and it's also darn cute. A skeuomorph might be a collectible shaded to look like it's made of gold, or buttons that are beveled so they look like real buttons. These UIs are iconic and flavorful, and they reflect something about the design of the game. With the rise of 3D graphics in the mid-90s, a lot of AAA games aimed for more complex storylines and less UI, in an attempt to provide a cinematic feel. Although these games weren't easy, they had some gameplay affordances that made it easier to strip away the UI, like auto-aim and relatively linear level designs. Plenty of big titles during this time still used beautiful, elaborate UIs with incredibly unnecessary flourishes. But as the gameplay complexity increased, so did the amount of heavy lifting the UI had to do. Game devs had to get creative with how to integrate information without just adding a thicker and more elaborate picture frame. So UI designers worked to introduce information diegetically. Diegetic refers to sounds or visuals that exist within the world of the narrative, which can be seen and interacted with by the game's characters. When I interact with my Pip-Boy in Fallout, the implication is this item exists in the game world, and I am interacting with it as both the player and the player character. And that's my arm on the screen. Diegetic UI elements are a godsend for game developers trying to avoid HUDs.
So when we got to the UI, the goal was trying to figure out what breaks the immersion of the game, and we've realized very quickly a lot of it was the HUD.
Dino Ignacio was the UI director for a little sci-fi horror franchise called Dead Space, which is still the gold standard of diegetic UIs over a decade after its release.
What we found effectively is the HUD is like a piece of glass that separates you, the player, from the character that you were playing. And so the way, if we can lift that off, then suddenly you've maintained immersion.
Ignacio and his team proved that you could make an entirely diegetic UI. Or really, a UI that seems entirely diegetic if the game has done the rest of the legwork to keep you immersed. Despite Dead Space's success, not a lot of games that followed were as ambitious with their design. Ignacio's team used their particle engine to make the UI, which is a uniquely difficult method. But in the time after the game's release, a lot of big studios relied on a third-party software called Scaleform, which allowed designers to make UIs in Flash and import them into the game. Which is handy, but it did result in a lot of very similar-looking UIs. The 2010s also gave us the concept of flat design, which is precisely as exciting as it sounds. It's why your phone's Note app doesn't look like a notepad anymore. You don't really see skeuomorphic design anymore, outside of smaller indie games, or big games where the interface is just like the whole game. The big titles have mostly given up on skeuomorphism, which is fine. Shifting winds will always change the shape of dunes. But franchises that once used a lot of texture now look just kind of samey.
Yeah, it's become more homogeneous over the past decade. And I don't know that that's a bad thing, but again, I do think at the same time, it's few and far between that we're seeing UI really being used in creative ways.
Unlike me, Zane's not unduly emotionally invested in over-designed HUDs.
I think the joke is that if I could make any game, the perfect UI is no UI.
Zane? You are blowing up my spot. But if the goal is immersion, and UI is the biggest obstacle to immersion, why not just get rid of it entirely?
It is a replacement for the senses that we would normally have in real life. So for example, when you're playing Halo or Call of Duty, we have to have a threat indicator to show you if you're getting hit off screen or in the back. Now in real life, you could probably tell if you're getting shot in the back, but you are limited to what you can see on screen. And so oftentimes the UI is meant to compensate for things that we would normally inherently know.
The same goes for holding your breath underwater, or climbing up a rock face, or knowing exactly how many milliliters of pee you have left in your bladder. At least for now, these physical sensations are very difficult to communicate outside of the UI. But you better believe that piss tech is coming. But that's not the only function UIs have. Part of the difficulty of UI design is giving players the right kind of information at the right time.
And so we tried to figure out, like, what of these elements do we need in the game, and what of these things need to be persistent. And we found out very quickly that the only thing that really needs to be persistent is your health. Because you want a second-to-second view of how you are doing and how far you are from failing or succeeding.
In a combat-heavy game, you'll probably always need access to your in-game Fitbit. But for, say, an exploration game, you might not. Some older games provided constant reminders of button functions, which I admit is overkill, but most modern games keep this information contextual, so they only pop up when relevant. See, the HUD is basically a replacement for your memory, at least according to Celia Hodent, the director of user experience for Fortnite, who incidentally has a PhD in psychology. She argues that UI is essential for cutting down on the player's cognitive load. So instead of you holding on to the information of how many rounds you shot, the HUD keeps track for you. That frees up your brain's processing power to focus on important things, like choosing the most appropriate dabbing animation. What all of this means is that too little information can be as disruptive as too much. Consider Breath of the Wild. Anytime I was cooking, I had to open a recipe list on my phone to get the right combination of super vital in-game effects that I needed. This is way more disruptive than just having an in-game cookbook would have been. The Last of Us 2 doesn't have a mini-map, and I didn't really miss it, except in the moments after finishing a combat encounter when Ellie would announce, out loud, to nobody, "Well, my job's done here."
Time to go.
Which is disruptive for me because, like, how did Ellie know that? I didn't know that. Shouldn't I know that? Aren't I her? I found this very frustrating. You might not have. Either way, the fact that a lack of UI can be disruptive proves that immersion isn't just about how few UI elements there are. In fact, this understanding of immersion is so widespread that game designers Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman dub it the immersive fallacy. In researching this video, I read many different frameworks for expanding the concept of immersion, but the one that seemed most useful to explaining Press F was the SCI model. SCI stands for sensory, challenge-based, and imaginative immersion. Sensory immersion is the thing that we kind of think of as immersion, the comprehensiveness and realism of the audiovisual experience. Challenge-based immersion is about striking the balance between the difficulty of the game and the ability of the player. Imaginative immersion is how interesting you find the stories and characters and just the overall world building. Sensory immersion in games has obviously improved pretty linearly over the years, but so has the imaginative immersion. Developers have become more invested in telling complex, dad-driven stories. Gamers don't just want to know how Mario jumps, but why Mario jumps, and game developers are here to tell them. It's because his dad didn't hug him enough. It's the challenge-based immersion that's become trickier. Success in this category is marked by a player achieving a psychological state called flow, known colloquially as straight-kicking it in the chill station. That's when the challenge of the gameplay and the ability of the player are working in sync. If the challenge is too high, the gameplay gets frustrating. But if it's too low, the player gets bored. When it's appropriately balanced, you become focused and less aware of the outside world, and time just drops away. Now, consider the skills you need to play a modern AAA open-world game. Platforming and spatial problem solving. Item gathering and crafting. At least one, but probably multiple forms of combat. As the complexity of modern games has increased, it's become harder to strike that flow balance, which is where UI comes in. A well-designed UI will give you that little hint you need at just the right moment to keep the cognitive load in check. Dynamic UIs provide context-sensitive HUD elements, weapon stats when it's beatdown time, stamina meters when you're flexing on them haters. When that HUD disappears entirely, you know you can kick back with a bottle of Moxie and just relax. Which is why QuickTime events are so fucking frustrating. The UI is telling you to kick back and relax, but that is a bait and Nintendo Switch. The SCI approach to immersion explains what's happening in notable HUD flubs like press F. The sensory immersion is great. I mean, look at that lighting and the high gloss on that coffin. The challenge-based immersion isn't at stake either. If there was a predetermined acknowledge sadness button and the player was taking too long to use it, it might make sense for there to be a contextual pop-up. But the game hasn't taught the player what button they should use in moments like this, so it tries to provide that information, even though it is unnecessary. And that's disruptive to the imaginative immersion, which is the aspect that's really getting damaged here. You're engaged in this serious moment, and the game boils down a complex emotion like mourning a fallen comrade to a button push. It is not the HUD's fault that feelings are complicated, but it is taking the blame here. Sadly, Ghosts of Tsushima that haven't learned this lesson are doomed to repeat it. It's not about having or not having UI, it's about how well that UI is integrated into the game. Or as professional UI designer and UI hater Zane would put it,
it's fine to have UI in a game as long as they don't realize that the UI is there.
Which is why people don't talk about how absolutely wild it is that Isaac's health indicator is on the back of his suit, where he, the character, cannot see it. That's not diegetic, and it doesn't really make sense. Isaac is every boss you've fought that has a glowing weak spot on its ass, the UI equivalent of a kick me sign. But that's where the legwork and finesse of the UI designer comes in. It feels right because you, the player, are so engaged with using that information that you don't process the fact that it doesn't really make sense in universe. In case you're wondering, I did ask Dino about this.
A lot of these people who had rigs working with others in situations where they could be compromised because they're minors or they're in space. And so having a readout that other people around you could see was important. I know that sounds hokey, but that's what we came up with. It worked for the time. At the end of the day, the user and their needs are more important than the narrative or the immersion that we're trying to build.
Which is why, even if we strip it down to the most basic, boring-ass components, we can't and shouldn't give up on UI entirely.